We have begun a journey into the New Testament, 1 Peter, and it seems as though the beauty of this church, of what we represent as a people, is an ever-expanding field of knowledge. You know, I think I look back at my own journey, and I think, I remember listening to Dr. Scott teach and reference some certain manuscripts, and it was like, just wind just went by until those manuscripts became a part of my knowledge and the basis for studies. I remember talking to somebody, and I had just finished a whole series mentioning P46, assuming that everybody knew what P46 was, which is the Chester Beatty Papyri, which I so often reference. And it's in this framework that as I began to prepare for this study, two things occurred to me. Scott, slow down, because I like to go by things real fast and make sure that everything is in the whole mix. Like just, and then you're left sitting there going, huh? So, one is slow down. Two is slow down going through the text. Because in the process of doing so, I hope I'm going to be able to show you why we do this. So tedious in some respects. Perhaps I've been called by a few too intellectual. I hope to aspire to that one day. All right, so, and I only meant that, with all due respect, I only meant that because those who say that I may be too intellectual don't know the capacity, perhaps, that God has in store for me to really become smart. Now, having said that, we were looking at the text last week, 1 Peter, and the first verse, which I have here on the board. And I'm alluded to certain things that I was going to reference. So indulge me for a minute, because there were many questions. I have the knack of doing this, of asking questions and then not answering them. It's the dangle effect to keep you coming back for more. So first, I'm going to ask the director to take my map, and I want you to listen to me. There's many discussions about who the author is, who I believe I've covered, which we believe with certainty is Peter. And he mentions all the folks that he's writing to. We have them in our first verse, and I kind of tried to highlight to you here the territories of Pontus, and then I gave you an arrow here, Galatia, Cappadocia. So I'm going down on the map here, then Asia again, so we're heading over to this territory called Asia, and then we head back up to Bithynia. You can see on this map there is these two places, Bithynia and Pontus, they've got an and between them, so they were conjoined. That signifies that this map is talking about a time somewhere slightly before or after 64, those two broke apart, and they were not one anymore. So there's a consolidation somewhere, and the fact that he's writing a cyclical letter, not addressed to churches, but to individuals, which I'm going to speak about in a minute, scattered throughout that region, which is a fairly decent-sized region. But the one thing that I forgot to point out, there's amongst many things, I'm sure, is the place of origin. Now, most people are convinced or quite sure that Peter was writing from Rome. And certainly we know that he would have met his death there. This is what the bulk of scholars say. So please go back to the map, and I'm going to give you my opinion. It is my opinion and my hypothesis. I have no biblical documentation to sustain this, but I'm telling you what I speculate with many other scholars, that Peter was writing from here, Rome. And if you really take a look at this, it really becomes even more staggering that Peter is secluded in this area, and he is writing to these people. I feel like the weatherman. He is writing to these people all the way over there. Now, why is all of this important? We're going to find out that through the study of this first epistle of Peter, there are some discrepancies which I have, I think, sorted out at the beginning. Your King James reads, let's read it for the folks who are listening, who may be Biblists. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Elect, begins verse 2, according to the foreknowledge of God, the Father, through sanctification of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ. And I stop there. Now, I only put verse 1 up on the board, and I simply wanted to show last week that this famous word, elect, which appears to be at the beginning of your verse 2, in the Greek sits in the first verse. Now, there's a lot of assumptions. I have to assume that many people have heard me say that there was no such thing as chapter and verse when Peter or Paul or any of these were writing. They just wrote. We know with certainty that the chapter and verse division, the verse division was done in 1551, and the chapter division, I think, was done about 1300, 1400, some not too long, between 12 and 1300, I think. Right, Bible answer man back there?
Yes,
What's the date, Langton?
It's in that section, 13th.
See, I like that. Somewhere around there. So I didn't mean to catch you off guard there, back there. And of course, the Hebrew Bible has its own set of divisions done at an earlier time. So why this becomes important is for this reason. I tried to find the oldest papyri that we could go back to and begin a journey to see who moved the elect. All right? Now, for people who, and you need to hear me out for a minute, for people who don't like archaeology or grammar or history, you're going to be bored out of your skull, all right? So I'll maybe just put you out of your misery real quick. But for the rest of us, this happens to be, for me, a very exciting journey. The territory of this journey begins with something called P72. And we're going to see if I can do this without messing it up too terribly here. There we go. All right, here's P72. Let's see if I can write on it. Hi, it's nothing like writing on old documents. It just gives you a sense of freedom. All right, now you're looking at the transliteration into text that we can read. The papyri itself, and I'm going to give you a little history of why this papyri. I'm going to be referring to it throughout all the study of 1 Peter, so I might as well plant enough seeds for you to say, I know what P72 is now. We taught you about P46, Chester Beatty Papyri, and the Chester Beatty Papyri isn't only P46, but this papyri is called, I'll write it here, is called the Bodmer Papyri, P72. And there it is at the top of the page anyway. These papers were discovered, it's believed, between Thebes and Panopolis. And the time frame of this coincides about the same time as Chester Beatty Papyri, except this is what's staggering. These papyri were sold to a man by the name of Martin Bodmer in 1950, in the 50s. And the location which they were discovered wasn't disclosed for 20 years. There's a kind of a little bit of a scandal behind this. So we'll leave that, and I'll tell you about that later on festival or something, because I know you all want to know about scandals. But here's the interesting thing. Inside this Bodmer collection, which does not only contain P72, but a whole host of papyri of different fragments, there was something inside the first batch of papyri, which is called Bodmer 1, which was a land register dated to 208-209 AD. Strangely enough, it was written on the back of a piece of the Iliad manuscript. Just because we had nothing else to write the land thing on. Oh, here. So that's what's fascinating, is it actually tells us a timeline for this papyri. By that land register that belongs to a piece of land with names that are commonly known to people who lived in that area, we know the papyri to be authentic. We know the papyri to at least be dated to 208, 209, that whole entire collection. Some parts of it in Sahidic. It's a real hodgepodge, and hopefully I can at some point provide some of the papyri examples, but I wanted you to get a clear text. I'm going to show you the text in a minute. For those of you who have studied with me for a while and with Dr. Scott, you know the manuscripts that we refer to as the Alexandrinus, the Sinaiticus, and the Vaticanus manuscripts. This actually in text predates it. Keep in mind, it's in a different place. It's in a different part by a different scribe. There's all kinds of little tidbits. Let me just say, and I'm going to, scholars who are manuscript scholars, forgive me for a minute because I'm going to butcher this to make it acceptable for everybody. Most of the Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus agree to about somewhere between 60 and 70% with this papyri. So in terms of information, it's pretty close for old documents to align. The affinities are very good. Now, what about Mr. Bodmer? You need just a little tidbit, and then you go fact-finding, all right? That's the fun part. I'll give you a little information. You go find the rest. In fact, if you really want to get a kick, go and visit online the Bodmer Library. You can take a visual tour of it, and it's got some great manuscripts, and it'll make you think about the manuscripts that we have in our possession. It'll make you think a little bit about what treasures we have available. Mr. Bodmer, who is deceased now, but he established his library on the 5 pillars of world literature, starting with the Bible, Shakespeare, Homer, Dante, and the last one, which is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. I think I said them all. If I didn't, it's okay. But that's his library. That's his collection, all right? So if you go and check this collection out online, you're going to see a lot of different things. But his fascination was the 5 pillars of literature. My fascination is, what does the Scripture say? So let me get there. I've given you that background and enough hints that you can go fact-finding and have some fun. If you're like me, I like to stir the pot and get people to go look for themselves and maybe find themselves somewhere. All right. Now, I want you to look at this, please. Here we have Petrus Apostolos. We have what's called the Nomina Sacra, Jesu Christu. So, Peter, apostle of Christ Jesus. And here's our word. In a second, we'll call it between 2 and 250 AD manuscript, eklektos is following Jesus. So we have the word chosen. You're going to find out why I'm going to make a deal about this elect chosen thing. You see, the Greek that I've put up here, this word is in verse 1. P72 shows us that it's in verse 1. Now, let me be sure to say there'll be some who say, is this going to mess up my salvation? No. But if we're going to pick apart things, let's pick them apart with a mind that says, show me all the manuscripts, show me, and this, by the way, is much better. It's much better to show you that than having to stand here and hold something, while the poor cameraman's trying to get a focus and we're all going, ugh. So this at least is a help. Now, I've taken you from the Bodmer Papyri, and as I said, the Bodmer Papyri is extremely important for 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and Jude because it contains the whole book. Each book, those 3 books, are complete, which gives us a pretty good old starting point. Now, if that's not good enough, you say, well, what else are you going to show me? This is the Sinaiticus. And I might as well turn my notes as I go through these things. And I may not get through I may not get through this whole series of copious notes I made for you, but do know that the heart and soul behind this is that exploring the Bible together and growing in knowledge is a lot of fun, and growing in His Word is even better. So the Sinaiticus, We have here what is commonly put as a 4th century, between the Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus 4th and 5th century manuscripts. And here we have again the beginning, Petros, Peter, Apostolos, you can see the little O and C at the end, Apostolos, Peter, Apostle. Here's your nomina sacra, there is Jesus Christ again. And look what we have here. We have the ekletos, right there, right after Jesus Christ. The one marvelous thing about this manuscript is that its copier, Mr. Tischendorf, complained that it was the most corrected of all the old manuscripts, and yet it is in agreement with P72. So when you begin to look at these things, you say, well, where exactly did the change occur and why? All right, bear with me. We're going to move through time. We're doing a time continuum here. And I'm going to take you through some manuscripts. This manuscript we're going to put at the 7th century, between 7th and 8th century. And I am going to read you something about this manuscript. We had this manuscript on display for some time. It is called and I've got to say this right, the Amiatus manuscript. I don't know why that's difficult, because I look at it and I think Amia, and I want to break the sentence at Amia instead of Amiatnus. That's grammar for you. We have this manuscript on display, and the relevance to this, I'm taking you through the history of the manuscript very briefly. And believe you me, there are some folks, they just say, well, I'm just happy with my Massage Bible or my new Civic Bible or whatever it is you got. And if that's what you're happy with, then good for you. But as a history person myself, I'm not only fascinated with the translation through time, but I'm also equally fascinated with something that's just absolutely staggering. The survival of God's Word intact. The survival and the passing down through so many different ages. It's just an incredible history. So this manuscript, I want to read a little. This would be from Bruce Metzger, who was, in my opinion, and again, I always tell you when it's my opinion, but in my opinion was, bar none, the greatest expert on manuscripts that lived for his time. Just absolutely brilliant. The early versions of the New Testament, the origin, transmission, and limitations. And this manuscript that you are looking at above my head, thank you, generally considered to be the best authority extant for the Vulgate text. It's a magnificent copy of the entire Latin Bible, and it gives the contents and so forth, but there's a little bit of strange history. It was written early in the 8th century in the north of England, either at Wearmouth or Jarrow, from manuscripts brought from Italy, perhaps by Theodore of Tarsus when he came to England to be Archbishop of Canterbury in 669. Now, why this is all relevant is that this manuscript was intended to be gifted to the Pope at Rome, Pope Gregory II, and the person who was carrying it on the way died. Oops. So, it was carried to Rome by some of his companions, subsequently given to the monastery of Saint Salvatore at Monte Amiata, whence that's where its name is derived from. It's just a little sidebar, but this piece of information tells you it is the most extant Vulgate. Now, for those people who don't know what the Vulgate is, that's an apple of a different color, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. You never thought you were going to get a history lesson, but I said, you're going to leave here, your brain's either going to hurt, you're going to hate me, or I don't know. All right, here we go. So, here we have the Epistle of Peter. And here we go. So we have Petrus, Apostolos, and we have here Jesu Christu. And by the way, I'm reading from a Latin version. We're no longer in the Greek, if that wasn't obvious. And here we have the word electus. If you can see that, so even the Latin in this particular version follows the two manuscripts I've just pointed out to you. electis, and this word advenis, dispersio. So strangers of the dispersion, and then it goes on to say the places and so forth. You can see the Latin, though, in this example clearly shows you where electus is. So who moved the elect? That's what I want to know. Who moved the elect? Now, I've got to come back to talk about this Vulgate. And the reason why it will not make sense to you by the time we get to the English manuscripts, so much time has passed. We know that Greek permeated the then known world. Let's talk about the time of Alexander the Great, 330 some BC, clear up to and through the time of Christ. We know Greek was the language, the lingua franca of that empire. We know that for certain. But not too much is talked about Latin. And that's where I happen to walk into the black hole and go, oh, I didn't really recognize that there was so much to know about this language that is now dead and forgotten. The Latin Vulgate brings us into a new mystery of manuscripts because all of these manuscripts that come down to us eventually will form, because of Mr. Erasmus, whom I will get to, the basis for what we call the Textus Receptus, the Latin version that stands behind a translation supposedly from the Greek, which our King James represents. So when you're looking at this King James, you're really not looking at a right depiction of translation, as we tend to just pass it by real glibly. So Latin becomes an important language. This is why I do these things. I know that by the time we get to the Latin manuscripts, electus or elect or the eclectoi are still behind Jesus. They're still after Jesus. And then sometime between the 7th and 8th century, somebody moved it. And it came out of the Latin translation. So that began the quest of a whodunit thing, because that's the way my mind works. I want to know who done it. And why did they do it? Or why did they done it, right? If you want to know like I do. And what will this do to the text? Because that's the bigger question. Once we tackle the translation issues, what will it do to the framework of the text? So, I think I'm going to save the Latin discussion. As important as it is, I'm going to save the Latin discussion because it's very intense. The Latin covers 7 periods. There are 7 periods of Latin language, which I won't bore you and put you through, but from 75 BC clear to modern times. It's divided into 7 sections. And this Latin translation, it's the only period that I really have to highlight. From 200 to 900 is called Vulgar. And yes, it was. Vulgar Latin. That's the period we're concerned with. You see, forget about English for a minute. Pretend, if you can, pretend English doesn't exist for a minute. And the whole then known world is operating on the Greek tongue, and there's some peppered in different tongues, but primarily Greek is the language. Then how did Latin come to its power? And everybody always gets confused and thinks, well, surely the Latin language was the powerful language of the Roman Empire. But no, it was a military language. It was not the language that we perceive it to be. And guess what? All of the Latin translations didn't emanate from Rome. Wouldn't that be logical, that all of the Latin translations would come from Rome? But they didn't. They came from North Africa. So, that's just, I'll just leave that there. How's that? And then you can say, what the hell did she say? Because that's an area we need to discuss, the Latin manuscripts. But right now I want to drive my point home to show you how this evolved. And again, we'll open up some manuscripts we haven't even touched. But let's move on in our quest because I'm going to run out of time. So, our next deal happens to be a side-by-side, and we're going to date this sometime after 1384. These are Wycliffe translations. Yes, that is English. And please try and bear in mind that the language frame changed dramatically. Thank goodness. I may have to explain some words for you folks who are reading going, what does that say? All right. I want you to look at, in this first line here, Peter, apostle of Jesus Christ, to the chosen. All right? And there's nothing else going on in this verse after that. And we have the same thing here. Peter, apostle of Jesus Christ, to the chosen men. And this is very interesting because it tells you by the time our English language this is the birth of our language from Mr. Wycliffe's translations and his followers. You can see it hasn't been corrupted. So by the time the King James is produced in 1611, somebody had an influence somewhere. I'm going to move on. Forgive me for this, but I'm going to move through these as quickly as possible. So I'm giving you an idea. I've done my homework. This manuscript is a Latin manuscript, so we're back to Latin again. And I have to blow this thing up. Ooh, all right. Okay. Here we go. Down right at the bottom. What did we do before all of this wonderful technology? So this manuscript, which I showed some of you, and I'm writing on it right now. 1485. I'm not writing on it. For some of you that know, it's just a pen that is erasable. See, I can take that and erase that. Oh, thank goodness. Oh, look, I erased some of the watermarks, too. All right, 1485, Latin translation. And this, again, all of these manuscripts, except for the Bodmer Papyri, all of these manuscripts which I'm presenting to you are all in our possession. So these are all coming from our library to be able to make this presentation to you and give you the voyage through time. Really chronologically now we're going, not translation-wise, but chronologically. So here we have Petrus, Apostolo, Jesu Christu, and here it is again, electus. And the wonder of that is that still by this time, the word is still in the right place. We move on, because one man is the culprit behind all of this, which just absolutely bothered me. Why? Here we have a side-by-side. You're going to love me now. You're going to say, okay, get to the point. This is a 1530s side-by-side parallel of Mr. Erasmus's translation and the Vulgate side-by-side. And here we have Peter, apostle of Jesu Christi, of Jesus Christ. And here we have the text. This is what you're going to like. And I'm going to get to the right page so I can follow along with my notes, because you're going to like this. Some of you are already reading before me and saying, I see it already. I see that it's not there. Correct. All right. Here we go. I've got my side-by-side. So, Adventis, which is strangers, sparsim, scattered, in colletibus, inhabitants of Pontum, Galatium. He's naming all the places. Here we go. Delictis. Delictis. This is a past participle of election or elected ones by the, watch this, here we have disconnected the whole sentence and inserted a new word, a new terminology. Delectis, chosen or selected, which is a past participle of deligo, to choose, to wish to select, by prefinitionem, which is a predetermined purpose. So Erasmus, when he did his work in 1522, he changed the text. Because the Vulgate, I'm showing you side by side, still has electus. Can you see that? How one man could take hundreds of years, and I do no or any critical work against Mr. Erasmus's translation, except that he altered the text, and he doesn't just do it in one place, he'll do it in many places. Now, before you start throwing eggs at me or Mr. Erasmus, who is dead, by the way, let's take a look at his work, which we have a fine example of. So this is one of our manuscripts. I would say the example par extraordinaire of Erasmus's work as he did it, taking the Greek text with the side-by-side of his Latin translation. And let's use a different color right now, blue. So let's look at his Greek text that he was using. We have here, and this may look abbreviated to you with all of its little ligatures. That's the minuscule writing of the Greek text at the time. It's not that big uncial capitals. These are fancy. By the way, drove the printers crazy. They hated this stuff because it was like, how do you print this? But Peter, apostle of Jesus Christ. Oh, look, it just happens to be right there. Eklektois. How convenient. But this is side by side the text that Mr. Erasmus used and the translation that he came up with. So Peter, apostle of Jesus Christ, at Venice, here we have again strangers, scattered, inhabitants, and we read through the whole text. And it just so happens that the elected by the predetermined purpose of God. So the culprit in moving the word elect is through this translation. And why this was necessary. Last Sunday, I sat down on festival and opened up something called the Nestle Allens, if anybody was watching. And Nestle Allens is the gold standard. And yet, in their manuscript, in their gold standard, they said that this word was, how we have received it is proper, and that it was originally inserted in here and didn't belong. And that I said, well, wait a minute, I've seen all the papyri from 200-300 to 4th and 5th century to the 7th and 8th century, and I don't see any change until I get to Erasmus's work. So I had to go back and double check why. Well, for you scholars, between Nestle Allen's 25th and 26th edition, they made a change. And they decided that 66% of P72 wasn't enough to be correct and that Erasmus had to be right, so they moved their opinion. And that's why I said to you, this is my hard head that will go and I'll dig and I'll dig and I'll dig and I'll dig till I can't get to the bottom of it, I'll pray it through or something. But so this at least gives you an idea. Now you say, pray tell me, how is this going to help me? You've just taken me through a whole litany of translations. How is this going to help me? It's going to help you big time. It's like cod liver oil, all right? So here we go. This is my modern translation, and please, the words as they appear in the interlinear may not be exact or appropriate, but I'm showing you the text that I am now using. Petros, Apostolos, Jesu Christo, Eklektos. All right? And now I want to speak about this Eklektos and how it affects us. You see, the positioning in verse 1, as it appears, as I've just shown to you, is modifying the people who are living amongst the periepidemos. These chosen people, these chosen ones, who are living among a populace. Is that not who we are as Christians today? We are chosen people of God, living among a scattered populace. I've got people from all over California sitting in front of me, and some maybe listening from other parts of the world. Scattered, peppered, sown, if you will, as the text reads. And why this becomes an important example for me to explain where this fits in. If you take this word out of here and move it into verse 2, something really terrible happens. No, the earth doesn't shake. But let me talk to you. First, as a historian, I've just shown you what happens when somebody makes a translation and they're not being careful. This has prompted so many doctrines which Peter, I'm sure, did not mean to propagate. He was simply saying this letter is sent out to all of you scattered people living amongst a populace of people, heathen, Jew and Gentile. We know Peter was the apostle, the one writing to the Jews, to the circumcision. But I'm sure he didn't say, well, look, sorry, you're converted to heathen. I can't write to you. Can't receive it. Sorry, that's another church. So my point is that he was trying to not make a cause for grammar or a cause for doctrine, but simply to explain how these people living amongst a people, were chosen. Now, as a grammarian, I just told you as a historian, I just spent an hour showing you historically why I had to get to the bottom. But as a grammarian, this word is an adjective, and it modifies, it must agree. God, some of you are just going to hate me today. You're going to say, I hate her. I hate her. This must agree with what it is modifying. Elect ones, chosen ones, it's modifying this word, the parepidemos, those people amongst whom they were scattered. And the grammar lets me say this word belongs with this word because it is modifying it. This is an adjective, and this is an adjective, and this is pretending to be a noun. The demos, the populace. So grammatically this belongs here. And the reason why it will be in conjunction with verse 2, but it does not go exactly right next to according to the foreknowledge and so forth, there's a reason. When Erasmus moved the chosen or elect next to the foreknowledge of God, something else happened along the way. One of the things that Erasmus accomplished when he moved the elect next to the foreknowledge of God was that this word, foreknowledge, prognosen, also changed. Some places it is defined. Listen carefully, it's the subtleties. And then you say, well, why? I get it, why people get confused. According to the foreknowledge of God, what God knew before, but not predetermined as he translated. He took the liberty to use, there are 2 or 3 Latin words which are very separate and distinct. One of them, the presentia or presentium, which is the foreknowing, prescient, foreknowing, versus the prefinitionem, which would be the predetermined purpose. So by Erasmus's translation, we arrived with doctrines that said that God had chosen out a previously determined outcome. Oh boy. And doctrine spawned from this. Now, if you don't believe me, I have very good evidence on tons of writing between the debates of Erasmus and Luther regarding free will and how salvation comes to man, which would make your head and your eyes just go, please stop. So it's abundantly clear that there was some bias in here in translating. You know what? That still exists today. This is why sometimes I preach things and teach things that are not popular. But they don't have to be popular. They only have to be, as I've done today, showed you a path, backed it up with the information, told you when I'm hypothesizing, which you can distinguish between factual and opinion, and then arrive at a logical conclusion that God's foreknowledge is not the same as something that is predetermined. You say you're going to split hairs? To know beforehand is not to say it has been therefore determined that this will happen and this is the outcome. God may know and he may be omniscient and omnipotent, but man still has a free will to bleep up, and we do. If you don't like that, go try some other apples on for size. Eve did. That's the danger that God created this creation and then gave it a measure of free will. The greatest debate in all of theology lies between, I try to make this really simple because, man, I think I bit 5 different areas of that book off while I was reading it. Between Luther, who believed in the complete depravity of mankind, there's no good in him, and I happen to agree with Martin Luther on that there is no good. We're born in this sinning Adam container. I believe that. But I also believe Erasmus had some very valuable things. The problem in his debate with Martin Luther is Erasmus wouldn't take a position. So if you're church history people, you know what I'm saying. He said, it might be this, and it just might be this over here. And I'm just reporting. I'm just a reporter. I really don't want to take any position. And it drove the church world mad until Martin Luther finally, they had their head-on collision. The Catholic Church finally said, hey, Erasmus, pick a side. Now, Erasmus was the undergirdings of the Reformation, along with Martin Luther. No single person outside of Martin Luther had such great bearing on the Reformation, such as Erasmus. But Erasmus will go down in history as a man who refused to take a stand. He just wanted to have everybody hold hands and say, come on, let's all sing now. Let's all be happy and sing. And in the process, slip in some very biased remarks. Now, if you don't think that this is a deep subject, and it is, I'll tell you what happens. Unfortunately, I didn't make a scan of this, but you'll see why grammatically and historically some of these things, and there's going to be plenty of them through 1 Peter, become the basis for a theological meltdown where people who are not even paying attention anymore to the writer, what was Peter saying? Not what is she saying or what he said. What was Peter saying to those people that we then can apply to ourselves today? I can say for myself, and you can say it for yourself, I'm chosen. You wouldn't be sitting here listening to this arduous lecture on church history if God didn't want to expand your mind. And some of you that tuned me out, you may want to repent in a little while. But let me just say this to you. The interesting thing is what we glean from this, what we take away from this, is that these were chosen people amongst the populace. Is that not you and me today? And I'm not interested in the doctrine of election and predestination. If you have the capacity to be listening today, you just say it with me. I'm chosen. I'm not only called, I'm chosen. You know, I really don't believe that while Peter was writing this, he was thinking about some treatise. Or let me go back to the text for a minute. I don't think when Peter was writing that he was trying to complicate. Well, if Peter was going to complicate things, why didn't he start with Peter, the guy who was impetuous and who denied Jesus 3 times with much zeal, now an apostle of Jesus Christ? Just the facts. Peter, a sent one, his sender, I tried to point this out last week, clear enough, of Jesus Christ, saying this is the emanation of my sending. Enough said that I'm called and sent to tell you people who are scattered throughout these areas, sown around the world. I want to tell you this. The whole letter talks and will speak about the called of God. And we're going to make a distinguishing remark, not today, but in a future message, to distinguish between how Peter observes Jesus, who was chosen of God, and he distinguishes that. Listen, don't talk to me about the mystery of the Trinity. I'm not going to stand here and try and tell you we can solve it like cutting an orange and separating it so precisely. But he will make some very important distinguishing aspects between God the Father, who chose the Lamb slain from the foundations of the earth, chosen like that, in a case that shows movement of the Father, putting his hand into the stream of time to, at a certain point, interfere, if you will, or accomplish his purpose, versus we who are listening, who are hearers, who are now recipients. And there's a vast difference. Now, as I said, I don't think that Peter was writing some doctrinal treatise. He was conveying something very simplistic. And when we get down to it, we'll find out these people were getting a letter of encouragement from Peter saying, guess what? You chosen of God, you called ones. Don't let anybody tell you that because you're suffering, you're a second-class citizen. This is part of your choosing, your being called, because he's going to talk about the called. This is part of the parcel. An inescapable lot if you want to look to Christ and look at his pattern. That's where you are right now, but take comfort. I'm giving you the comfort of a lively hope, the promise of resurrection. And tell you what, the testing of your faith, that's much more precious than any metal, silver or gold. This is the crux of the message of his writing. And this is why I said, you know what, I'll go through the history, as draggy as it may be for some, to get you to the point to see there's so much more behind this concept. That while we read elect in our King James, elect according to the foreknowledge of God, it sounds as though the electing purpose would sit here as God who foreknew separated out. Now listen, that may be the case, but that's not what's being said by the writer. And that's why I said, you know, how many hundreds of commentaries do you think I have on 1 Peter? Lots. And guess what? They all do the same thing. Everybody comments on the elect according to God's foreknowledge. And that's wonderful, but that's not what Peter was saying. And Peter is simply saying, a chosen out people from among a band of scattered people everywhere. Hey, listen, how do you differentiate between the guy who's over there in Cappadocia, if it's 1 or 100 or 1,000, if it was a church or if it was one elder? How do we differentiate between the one guy who's going to be the recipient? Is he the only guy that's going to be elect? In all of Cappadocia? Did God arrange it so only one man heard? Listen, why do we put God in a box? That's my better question to all these theologians. Why do we put God in a box? Can God not save who he wants? And is there some procedural method to saving people? Man, I read some commentaries. I thought, oh, God, help us. Because everybody will make this into some type of a soteriological, this is how salvation occurs. But the problem I have with that is that's not so. According to how I read, the Apostle Paul was saved. There wasn't some activity beforehand except for Paul going out and terrifying Christians everywhere. Did he love God? Absolutely. He loved Yahweh. What about Zacchaeus? He climbed up in the tree to listen to Jesus. And then when Jesus was moving through the crowd, he came down. Of course, short little man. He had to get up in the tree to see Jesus. And they went in the house, and who knows what they said. And Jesus comes out, and he says, this day salvation has come unto your house. Will you invite and receive Jesus today? One man who I just so applaud in his commentary on the theological debates between Erasmus and Luther. He said the problem with Luther is he's got too much, the problem with Erasmus rather, is he's got too much synergism. He blended. He was so opposed to Luther's over here can't be broken from this depraved person that in Erasmus's mind, synergism. We're co-workers with God in the respect of our salvation. I do a little bit, he does a little bit. That was eventually the synergism that labeled him a humanist because he believed that it was a joint effort. Now listen, I can't describe or define the mystery that occurs in the mind, or if you want to call it the heart, of men and women. I can't define it for you. I can't tell you. And anybody who claims that they can, they're full of it. No one knows the mystery that occurs inside a person's mind when they're going from darkness into light. Whether they were in darkness, thinking about going into the light for a time, or whether they were walking in light but just hadn't fully come into it. I don't know. That's a mystery, and it's a deep mystery, and it's not, believe you me, I think if God wanted us to know every single dimension of his workings, he'd put it in a book. Except there are certain things he hasn't explained that clearly. And I believe those are the divine things that when we get over there, we'll go, that's how it works? Oh, you mean I spent all this time fussing about this, and that's how you do it? Yep. So, I think the best thing that I can say here as we make this journey together is that these people being described, these elect amongst a populace, these people who are being addressed that are scattered, guess what? Bring it into the now. We're talking about the same group of people in the same dimension. They're still suffering. There's still the trials and testing of our faith. There's still the world that hates us and the flesh that's always there to put up a good fight. And of course, the devil, if you happen to believe in the devil. And all of these things combined make it a tough, tough trip. But for those that will hear and receive the message, these, whomever they were that were recipients, whoever you are today receiving the message, take some comfort that all of what we go through as Christians, God's not some sadistic, he's not sitting up there saying, well, how's she going to get out of that one now, huh? Or let's see what she does. Let's see how much she squirms in this one. It's the trying of your faith. And the basis, by the way, of this whole epistle will be what we do in trial and tribulation. How we view the trials and tribulations and sufferings. Are we eulogizing and praising God as we go through? If we're called of him and chosen, and that, by the way, is not for me to decide, and it's certainly not a doctrine that belongs in this particular verse, then only one thing is to be said. You will have troubles. Oh, darn it, I thought you were going to tell me something better than that. And you will have suffering. Oh, well, Pastor, what do you do with people that say, you Christians, somebody told me this the other day, you Christians, you want to talk about how good your God is. Well, how can a good God let bad things happen to good people? Now, I wish I would have been there responding to that person. I wasn't, but I wish I was, because I would have said two things. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. Stuff happens, right? Stuff happens. And I'm sorry, let's take it out of the religious framework of Christianity. Bad things happen to good people, if you want to use that, who are Jews, who are Muslims, and who are atheists. God in his book never promised that you'll walk in a way that won't have you bent out of shape, or have you have a burden on your back, or have something that will mold and shape your character. He never promised that. He promised he'll be with you through it all. That's the promise he gives, that he'll be with us, not I'll spare you. And by the way, the only way that we become children of God is to go through a little bit of testing of fire, and that's where God sees how much of this child is hanging on to me and how much of this child is hanging on to the world. That's the test he looks for, your faith and my faith, to see. By the way, it's the only criteria for getting into heaven, our faith. So I'd say to all those people who want to labor through and make some feel like they're in this select band of people and others not here. Peter was writing to a people who were persecuted. As Christians, we suffer enough. Now, I don't know the degree, some more and some less. But the God I serve, I don't think he's looking. And the God you serve, I don't think he's looking and saying, well, Now, that's basically a good child down there. But, who cares? Make a ladder fall on her today. Who cares? That's not the God I serve. But I do know the forces around me and the forces that control the air. And I do know that God has not said, I'm going to keep all this. He does say He'll build a hedge. But I can tell you my hedge isn't always in the protection mode. There are times when I slip a little bit in the faith, and I tell you this as a perfectly normal human being, and that hedge, the minute my faith starts to wane, and it does because I'm human, the hedge goes too. The only thing that's guaranteed for that hedge is my faith connection in Christ. So for all the perfectionists out there, or the electionists, or whatever you want to call yourself, get real. Real Christians suffer and labor through life, and the reward, there's a simultaneous happening. The sufferings and the trials and the tribulations, and that's why we're told to rejoice in them. I know I'm a child of God because stuff is happening in my life. And God's using that stuff to make me more like Him and less like the ugly me that I've been my whole life. That's what got me here in the first place. Not that at this point it's bad, but in His eyes, He's using it all for His glory. So, if this letter seems a little tedious at the first for you and for me, cheer up, saints. You know it's going to get worse, so just hang on in faith. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.